Welcome, everyone. My name is Daniel Roth. I teach and direct the Pardis Center for Judaism and Conflict Resolution. And I am here with Rabbi Dr. Marc Gopin, who also teaches and directs the Center for World Religions, Diplomacy, and Conflict Resolution here at George Mason University. And today's course that we're going to be studying together is called the Rodef Shalom, Pursuing Peace in Judaism. And to say a word of introduction about who this Rodef Shalom is that we're talking about is that throughout Jewish history, and you can find this in 12th century Spain, 16th century Prague, 19th century Morocco, there were people in Jewish communities who were called Rodfei Shalom, pursuers of peace, or Mitavchei Shalom, peace brokers. And these people, when they heard of conflicts, interpersonal, intercommunity, they didn't wait to be invited. They quickly went and they activated and engaged with the conflicts that they were hearing about. And unfortunately, it seems that this sort of indigenous traditional model of the peacemaker has been a little bit lacking from our culture in the last several decades. And part of the vision of this course that we're going to be studying together is to bring back that identity, bring back that idea within the community of a Rodef Shalom. So we're going to be studying about who these people were, about texts that talk about the identity, the methods, the models, but at the same time, integrating it with some of the best that Western modern conflict resolution studies and theories and experience can bring to it. And that's about the course. And about the method of how we're going to do this is we're going to be encouraging those who are watching this to study the text that you'll see, the traditional Jewish texts and the academic theories. Come in prepared with that kind of information. And then what we're going to be doing is modeling, Marc and I are going to be modeling the way we would want people to be studying these texts, which is in this Chavruta model, which is Chavruta is a peer learning model. And beyond the fact that that's the way, it's a traditional way of studying text, I think it's also an indigenous way of conflict resolution, because it's two people dialoguing in a sacred conversation around text, around different perhaps different interpretations of something. So this is going to be a conversation between the two of us and modeling that. And do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, Chavrusa is an interesting model because it's both very serious in terms of study and debate and intellectually it was the most intense period of my life studying Chavrusa and studying in pairs of learning. And at the same time, it's very relaxed and informal.
Right.
You can say anything, and you can relax, and you can have a good time. But you're really studying very, very serious issues. So it is a kind of a process of putting two minds together, but also coming with all of your biases and all of your preconceptions and everyone's perspectives, and then you're working out an engagement about issues that are in the text that you're studying from thousands of years ago, hundreds of years ago, other people as models, and then we're also engaging ourselves in our experience. And that's part of the fun of it, the challenge. And I think what we want is for these texts to be, and traditions to be socialized and to stimulate more and more co-learning on a global scale, between Jews, between everyone, because this is a classic indigenous way that people grow and figure out very, very difficult problems in the world,
right.
and have very powerful visions of the future, which is we'll talk about visioning as we go on.
Excellent, and it's something we'll also listening to you speak. We'll come back and discuss this idea of people disagreeing in kind of a respectful way sometimes when we talk about constructive conflict and the importance of people learning from each other and not just thinking they have all the answers by themselves. So let's get right into it. Yeah. So our first unit is Aaron Rodef Shalom, the ideal Jewish peacemaker. And the first source that you'll see on your source sheets is this Mishnah from Ethics of Our Fathers, 3rd century, Pirkei Avot. And I think it's an important place to start because it's kind of like the most, it's like the lowest common denominator of when you pull over anybody, whether it be a third grader who's religious, not religious, and say, tell me something about Judaism and peacemaking, I think many of them would say this Mishnah.
Right.
But the problem is it sometimes ends with this Mishnah. So I think it's a great entry into the conversation, but then we're going to explore how much further we can really go into the depths of Judaism on these sources.
And the primary thing today is going to be focused on, in this video, is going to be focused on Aaron the peacemaker. And what does that mean? And what kind of model is that? So Hillel, why don't we just read the text first? So go ahead.
Hillel says, "Be of the students of Aaron, love peace, pursue peace, rodef shalom, love people, and bring them closer to Torah." And one of the things that we want to, as a chavruta, as we're asking people to think about is, okay, you take this primary text, very cryptic, lots of ambiguities. What are some of the questions that we want to kind of unpack? And then we'll explore some of these more in depth. Some of them we'll just relate to briefly, but what are some of the questions that come up, when you read this Mishnah, and I'll share some of my questions.
Right. So one of the things that we talked about is that there's a distinction here between loving peace and pursuing peace. Mm-hmm. So what is the difference between ahava and love on the one hand, and pursuing and redifa, or that act of pursuit, which is a very radical idea. Why does that come up? Well, we know that it's based on most rabbinic ideas from the first century are based on interpretation of far older texts in the Torah, in the written Torah, right? In the 5 books of Moses and in the Tanakh. And this is a Psalms. And there's a Psalms text that clearly says, "Seek peace and pursue it."
Right.
So pursuing is a very radical idea, mm-hmm. and the rabbis knew that, and they already knew that. Okay, if Saturday happens, this is what you do on Saturday. But this says no, go out, pursue something that's not there.
Okay.
And that's where Aaron in this text, or the student of Aaron, is somebody who loves peace, which is a highly internal experience, and then pursuing, which is a highly social, almost aggressive experience.
Okay.
So that dichotomy is interesting to me. The other dichotomy that's interesting is that it's again radical, because it's love all people. Mm. But even that translation may not be accurate, because the literal Hebrew is briot. Love all creatures. Briot, right. Creations, which extends even beyond. It's not just that it's not just Jews. It's not just that it's not just religious Jews. It's all beings.
Right.
Which in Buddhism called all sentient beings, which is a very radical idea. I thought that I should translate this at one point as sentient being, because the word briot is very radical.
Right.
There's many other laws. There's all sorts of laws that are Jews dealing with other Jews. There's all sorts of laws about human beings, Adam. This is radical. Right. And why is that there? Why does that love have to extend everywhere in order for this peace principle or practice to be effective? Mm-hmm. And then, what does it mean bringing everybody to Torah? Mm-hmm. What is Torah here? Because we know in Tanakh that in the written Torah, that Torah is much larger than what we know colloquially as Torah, as traditional Jewish life. Right. It's instruction, it's wisdom, and what does it mean to bring people closer to that through the pursuit of peace?
Right.
What kind of pursuit of peace makes people smart and wise? What kind of pursuit of peace does not?
Right.
Sometimes it could make people less smart.
Right.
So what is it to make it move in that direction of wisdom?
It's interesting about the that last part about bring them closer to Torah. If you read it, it's almost, you can think like, is this whole thing just about like outreach? Is it just about we're just doing this to get people to come closer to Torah? Right. And actually this troubled medieval scholars, that some suggested to read the Mishnah differently and said, be of the students of Aaron, love peace, pursue peace, period, end of Mishnah, new Mishnah, love people, bring them closer to Torah, because they couldn't understand, they couldn't reconcile what does bringing closer to Torah have to do with pursuing peace and Aaron. So, and others came along and said, along what you were saying, is wait, what is the Torah that we're bringing them closer to? And especially when we're talking about Hillel. That Hillel, some of you may know, is famous for his statement of when somebody came and said, "Teach me all the Torah on standing on one foot," he was able to say, "Don't do unto others that which is hated, to you, hateful to you." And then the rest is commentary, meaning the essence of his Torah was about loving people.
Right.
And if that's the essence of Torah, is about loving people, it's that humanizing idea, then it integrates well with loving peace and pursuing peace.
And then there's also the mystical reading of this, which would be, and I'm reading a lot about that in Chassidus and other places, the mystical or deeper reading is that Torah is the knowledge or wisdom that everything is one. I mean, the great pursuit of Jewish spirituality and mysticism has been that the world is very unified, we just don't see it. Or that we need to make it more unified. So that the wisdom of pursuit of peace is the wisdom of Torah. It's the discovery of unity.
Right.
And the harmony of all of us beneath all of our conflicts.
Right.
That is an interesting take on why Torah and pursuit of peace and shalom would be in the same text also.
And I'll just add as well, I think hearing you speak is that we actually kind of use this mission as part of our training model of what does it mean to try to encourage people to become a Rodef Shalom, a pursuer of peace today. And part of that is through Torah texts that we're doing right now that are going to inspire people to go out and pursue peace and love people. So there's, it's integrating, but acknowledging the fact that not all religious texts are going to encourage that. It's almost up to our responsibility to make sure that the Torah we're bringing people closer to is integrated with loving people, loving peace, and pursuing peace. So I think there's some other questions that might come up about how do we know that Aaron, where do we know that from? There's some sources that we're going to come back to that later and see and how that contrasts to Moses in the Bible. But I think right now we're going to just kind of move on.
Get through some of the questions.
So we're going to focus on a few of the questions that come up here, starting with why does it need to say be of the students of Aaron? I mean, Hillel could have just said love peace, pursue peace. Why add be of the students of Aaron? I mean, it seems superfluous. Right. And I brought here, you can look at the sources, this Rav Shmuel de Avzada, 16th century Svat, who says, well, you see, because everyone in the world, he says, thinks that they love peace and pursue peace. But yet there's so many conflicts. Right. And there's so many people who are causing pain to others at the same moment that they think that they're loving peace and pursuing peace.
Right.
As I like to say, it's like, I'm pursuing peace. It's the other guy who's pursuing the conflict. He's one. And Rav Shmuel de Avzada comes along and says, listen, until you are a student of Aaron, you're not really pursuing peace. And this idea of kind of creating a standard of who has the license almost, what kind of person do you have to be able to really be doing this right. I think it's something to strive for.
Yeah, well, it raises all the issues of, you see this in the history of ethics, there's been this deontological ethics, there's all sorts of ethical philosophies. And one of them is virtue ethics, and the classic representative is Aristotle, and the idea of creating a personality. Why do you want to create a personality? Because so much of ethics is complicated and contradictory. There's so many situations that require different ethical calculations that in the end of the day, you need a model, or you need a certain kind of personhood and a spiritual discipline that helps you habituate, and this was very important in Aristotelian ethics, the habituation to a certain kind of character, which we're always messing up. I mean, ethics is about imperfection. But it's about aspiration towards something. And so discipleship, if you just take away Aaron for a minute and you just say, there's two elements of this basically. One is the Aaron that we know from the Talmud, the Aaron that they imagined, right? With all the different stories, and that's worth study.
Which is not necessarily the biblical Aaron. We'll have to talk about that later.
Exactly.
Yes.
It's in general in scholarly study. You don't think about the biblical Aaron. You think about, okay, what did this rabbi say Aaron is? Right. And what did this rabbi say Aaron is? And you start to construct from that, what is the personality of the ideal peacemaker? Right. And who do I want to be a disciple of? Right. Is the Aaron that they remember, the Aaron that they're advocating? is somebody, and we'll get into that in the later videos, of what are his methodologies.
Right.
But from an ethical point of view or psychological point of view, it's important at this point to say that setting up Aaron, setting up discipleship, is saying that this is way beyond, five practices and 10 outcomes. That's the secular, often
skill building.
The skill building. It's way beyond skills, way beyond outcomes. It's about discipleship and about a kind of a work and a personality and a character, a way of life, a way of being, with all the obvious imperfections or failures that we all do every day. But the aspiration is, who do I have in mind? Who am I mindful of? And how, in these very difficult moments, who am I thinking of? And how am I trying to be that way? That seems to be a really good reason to have, a disciple idea. It doesn't have to be just Aaron in the end, for Jews, for non-Jews, for anybody. And we'll get into that by the end of...
and we'll see that there were actually different kind of ideal Jewish peacemakers. We're going to talk about that in the next unit. But it's just listening to it and saying, like, my gosh, it's like, when does this training start? It doesn't start when you take like a 60-hour course that's going to train you, and this is, or in these kind of courses. That's not where the beginning and end is. It starts like when people start learning good character traits at a young age. I mean, it's about creating a personality of modesty and humility. I mean, Aaron's whole ability to intervene had to do with what kind of individual he was. He's not just somebody who puts on that suit and tie, shows up to a conflict, just screamed at his neighbor and wife, and then can solve people's problems. I mean, if he does that, if he screams at the neighbor, and then thinks he's going to be able to solve the problems between the different tribes, he's already lost before he even started talking. Because he lost he lost that honor, that role modeling, that spiritual presence of who he is.
One of the texts that's not here is that thousands of Jews in the desert named their kids after Aaron.
Yes.
And they pick up on the biblical emphasis on mourning for Aaron that's kind of not there about a few other people. And they say, there were thousands of kids named Aaron because he healed so many conflicts in families.
Yes.
And they were so grateful that they named their kids after Aaron. So that's a way of being. That's something that he had to, work on his whole life to become that kind of human being. And that's what many of us in conflict resolution and healing that have done, great work in the world, and there are a lot of people who've done amazing work. These are things you started working on when you're 5 years old. Right. Peacemaker in the family, dealing with your own wounds and your own needs, but wanting to bring people together. All of these things that become a kind of way of being that are skills are important. Some methodologies in mediation are great, but in the end of the day, it's a kind of way of being that becomes a spiritual path.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to quote this scholar Marc Gopin. You might have heard of him, where he says here at this source that you'll see in front of you, where it's important of both paradigms to learn from each other. And I think that there are some great things that these Jewish models or indigenous non-Western models, and we'll see a lot of similarities to Arab Islamic kind of, or other kind of cultural models of where the respected person is kind of able to be the peacemaker. But I think also we're going to see that there's so many great skills that need to be, these problem solving, separating, that also has to be integrated. And that's part of what we're going to be exploring. So, and we're going to come back and talk at the end about role modeling and who our role models are.
So I think that we covered this love piece and pursue piece as both external processes that we're going to get to and an internal process.
I just want to add two things, if I can.
Sure.
Is one, I think this source, Avot de Rabbi Natan, which is sort of a 6th century rabbinic text on Pirkei Avot, on ethics of our fathers, which says it's not enough to just sit in your house and and call yourself a pursuer of peace. You have to go out to the marketplace. And I think that's, where is this marketplace today for us is really a question, because I think it's about being passive or being, if we're just sitting and studying text, whether it be in the Beit Midrash, in the study hall, or in the university, and we're not also practitioners, then what are we? And where are the people? They're not just in text. We're not, it's in the marketplace. And that's something that we're going to see in the next unit, Where the peacemaker is, he's in the road where people are interacting. And I think that's a great challenge of thinking, where is that marketplace for us today?
Yeah, I remember my life has been a series of moving out of comfort zones. And I remember I was I grew up very, very close to Rabbi Soloveitchik. And I was his secretary later on, but there's a deep friendship when I was a child. And I remember that he taught me how to get out of your comfort zone, especially with public speaking, and about moving into the realm of strangers and being able to engage strangers and feeling comfortable with that. So it was a slow and steady process of moving in that direction. And every stage of life, from 20 to now, was, okay, I think I'm going to go across the road I think I'm going to meet a Christian community. And I think, because I grew up so sheltered. Right. So sheltered, so completely involved in deeply Orthodox Jewish life. First it was the Christian world, and then it was the Arab world, and the Muslim world, and the Palestinian world, and the Syrian world for 7 years, and now in Afghanistan. And each time, it's moving beyond and dealing with the fear and dealing with the difficulty of a new set of skills. What's happening for me? Who do I hate? Who am I afraid of? How do I deal with that in the moment? And how do I put myself in the middle and in danger? Because Aaron, every time Aaron went to a husband and wife, he had no idea how they were going to react. Who was going to punch him out? Who was going to start cursing him out? He was a high priest. He had a lot of dignity, and yet he knew he was going to have to deal with complete unpredictability. Yeah. And that is it's very exciting, I have to say to people. And it's it's like a constant growing experience that I think is here too. So you kind of have to love the thrill of that, love peace, and then you have to get out there way beyond your comfort zone. Yeah. It can be 2 miles from your house. I'm not saying international is the only way. 2 miles from your house, there are conflicts that, believe me, oh my God, if you step into them, you're going to be in a whole new realm of experience. Right.
But also starting in our house.
Yeah.
Because it starts, it's right, it starts there. But this idea of going from city to city, from country to country, this is something that had a big influence on my thinking.
It's a very
in terms
radical
of kind of really
idea.
stretching, sometimes it bringing peace within a family, and traveling around, and I'll just say as a plug, just opening up these kind of learning centers of people engaged in this from city to city, and saying, it's not just in one place, but having it go out.
Just going out the way you're doing. Yeah. You've immersed yourself in 5 communities all of a sudden.
And who knows how many people are watching.
Conflicts and unpredictable situations, and the comfort of doing that, and the feeling of that as a spiritual vocation.
Right. And justifying why am I going
exactly.
to all these places? So it's nice to see these kind of sources encouraging us to do that.
That's also what mitzvah is. Mitzvah comes along, the idea of commandment, which is a very difficult idea to understand, frankly. In Jewish philosophy, and we've all had a hard time with what does that mean. Rosenzweig, you understand, got it so well when he said that feeling commanded is the issue. Feeling this as something I must do. Right. We've all felt, and between Immanuel Kant and Rosenzweig, we all know the importance of internalized senses of what I must do, or what I ought to do. And sometimes you have to internalize that to deal with a crazy world, to deal with a world that needs so much healing and so much imperfection that you're throwing. The metaphor I always use is that we're throwing ourselves into the deep end of the pool, and to be comfortable with that because it's a mitzvah, right? Because you feel commanded, right? That's a powerful feeling. It makes you do things that you might not want to do otherwise, right? So which question you want to cover next?
Okay, so there's so much more to be saying about that. I think we should. I want to just relate also about this idea of Ohev Shalom, and here Rav Shmuel Dev Zada talks about Ba'atzmo, like to oneself or almost within oneself. And here's we talked about this.
What do you mean?
Well, he talks about that first somebody has to love peace within oneself or to oneself, and I think that's.
What's the Hebrew here?
He says Ba'atzmo.
It's a Midrash Shmuel.
Yeah.
It's from the 16th century.
Yeah, he called it the Midrash Shmuel.
Oh, he called it
It's
Midrash
from
Shmuel.
Shmuel
It's not from
Dad.
the-
No,
okay.
it's not. It's not the Midrash on Shmuel.
And he said, where does he say it's Atzmo?
Here.
Okay.
Shehi
Shehu
Ohev Shalom la'atzmo.
To himself.
To himself.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so for me, it was like a question of, we've talked a lot about this idea of inner peace.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think this is like a really important place to kind of put that on the table and say, okay, before we're going around running and solving everyone else's problems,
Yeah.
it's like, what's going on inside? And I think that it doesn't mean that we have to be at peace where everything is tranquil and quiet and settled and kind of static, but at least trying to kind of be engaged with that conversation of balancing our different values, our different needs internally. And can we find that internal balance? This is how I take it. And if I can kind of find that internal balance, then I feel in a better sense of balance that I can help or feel like I'm in a position to kind of engage with other people's, who are split all over the place.
Well, I as a sort of Kohenian Kantian, I see these things more as an aspiration.
Right.
Because I know the reality of being in the middle of terrible conflicts and very violent or dangerous situations, that's the reality, but the spiritual idea of the text is the aspiration of peace to myself.
Yeah.
And so the way I've I've been struggling with, the Dalai Lama has this wonderful discipline of breathing in compassion for myself and then breathing out compassion for others. And I've been thinking about a prayerful mode to that of in Judaism, blessings are really, bracha is such a central motif. And it maybe even more than requests in prayer is bracha, right? Is blessing. And I was thinking of breathing in a blessing of peace to myself, and then breathing out a blessing of peace to others.
Right.
A kind of aspiration and intentionality that keeps you. And John Paul Lederach, the great Mennonite peacemaker globally, always emphasizes, and I've talked about it in my books too, that creating a kind of I call it an envelope to a moment of confrontation, where at the beginning of the envelope there's an aspiration to peace or an intentionality, and at the end, which they did in many places by prayer, actual prayer, is that it creates a kind of intentionality that moves you to a higher space. So I think this rabbi here is brilliant by saying that he begins with a kind of aspiration to atzmo, which is atzmo, as you know, is a very powerful Hebrew word.
It's the essence, it's the being.
It's the essence to my essence. Whoa! I wish I could do that.
This is two quick associations that come to mind as very quick, and then we'll move on. One is I heard a lecture by a wonderful peacemaker named Bernard Lafayette, who was one of Martin Luther King's right-hand men, and he was talking at this conference on religion and peace building, and here is a man who's involved in doing nonviolent training for people all over the world, doing great stuff. And he said, it was like this one offhand comment that was so profound. He said, I want to tell you something, 75% of organizations that are involved in saving the world is wasted on people fighting with the person in the office next to them.
Exactly.
And he said, because they're not Ohev Shalom Ba'atzmo first.
Yeah.
Or Ohev Shalom before you're Rodef Shalom. Love peace in the little inner circle of our lives. Before we're going out trying to save everyone else's life and killing each other as we're doing it.
Right.
That's one thing. And I'll just share quickly one other story, and I hope my wife forgives me for this, but I thought about this when I was supposed to give a Torah at a shul in Jerusalem, and I was going to talk about Abraham and Sarah and getting into their conflict, understanding their different perspectives and narratives, and then Friday afternoon being Friday afternoon can sometimes be a little stressful. And we're going to talk about this actually in the next source. Conflicts come up on Friday afternoon before Shabbat. And I just remember one Shabbat we had this, I don't even know what it was about. We were all like angry and crazy and getting ready. And I remember just saying, we have to sit down and talk about this right now. Because there is no way I can go ahead and start talking about Abram and Sarah's issues until I feel like we're able to kind of have that Ohev Shalom before we can start being Rodef Shalom. And I think it's a tall order, because I mean, gosh, if we don't have that, does that going to hold us back from being a Rodef Shalom? And I think it's about trying to strike that balance. So we'll move on.
Good. Let's move on.
All right. So the next big question that comes up is what is shalom? What is this shalom that we're pursuing? What do we mean by? I'm hesitant about even using the word peace because I like the idea of using this kind of ancient language of shalom.
Right.
What are we pursuing? And here the Abarbanel, as you see, he raises two possibilities, and he says, don't think, it's the first one, don't think Aaron was just about pursuing peace as the absence of conflict. He heard two people in conflict, and then he would go ahead and pursue that. Because Abarbanel says God's name is shalom. It can't be God's name is shalom, which comes from the root word shalem, complete, as just the absence of conflict. God's essence as a symbol is much greater than that. He said it's about creating a healthy, harmonious society. And then it's a question of who is a Rodef Shalom. I mean, it's not just somebody it's not just about, a case is about to go to court and we're going to head it off and send it into mediation, and that's the full scope of a Rodef Shalom, which is important. Right. But it's much greater. It could be the social worker, it could be the teacher, it could be anybody who is really committed to trying to create this kind of society that has social structures that are going to be healthy.
Yeah, and that's something that the rabbinic ethics is easily misunderstood by just taking one aphorism or one epigram or another. If you look at the totality of rabbinic ethics, there's so much about poverty and injustice. It's quite radical. There's so much about the social structure of things. There's so much about issues of honor and humiliation and sharing things properly. There's tons of literature on driving you crazy about how exactly to share a piece of property, right, or how exactly to share your boundary with your neighbor. I mean, all the Gemara, right, all the Talmud on that. So
not all.
They were, but they were,
okay.
It's hugely dangerous in our field in conflict resolution when people think that peace means the absence of violence.
Right, like a cold peace.
Yeah, it's very dangerous because obviously in certain situations of hot violence, then the first step is safety and security, because you can't even begin to rebuild or create harmony or forgiveness or apology or honor or a middle class with good jobs if nobody can go out on the street. And there are many places in the world where it's that hot. And your simple goal is to try and figure out how to get the people with guns to stop firing. Right. But that's so basic. And shalom, or the concept of peace, from the prophets, from Amos to Isaiah, the path to peace was through justice. Right. It was through equality. It was through honor. It was through taking the most vulnerable, the widow and the orphan, and women, and anybody who was considered more vulnerable, and making them honored. On Saturday, everyone celebrates and rests, right, so that there's even so many institutions.
Even the slaves in those days.
Yeah,
right?
Even the slaves in those days. So the idea that in our field in conflict resolution, we've been at great pains to help people understand, as we engage with governments and with police and with many others, that this isn't about pacification. Mm-hmm. This isn't about harmonization and getting people to be quiet.
Right.
One of the words that I dislike the most is when I hear somebody say, we want everybody to be quiet. We're looking to have that group be quiet. Because that's the opposite of peace. That's just simply suppression. And peace is not quiet. Peace is about equality, justice, a sense of acknowledgement of my past pain, and a sense of commitment to the future, a social contract. All of those are ingredients in peace.
Right.
That we don't want anyone to think that this Jewish idea or this shalom idea is just about everybody acting as if they're peaceful.
Right.
Which is always a danger in New Age work on peace and inner peace and outer peace. It's very easy to misinterpret it. But the really smart people in this field, and the really smart people in spiritual peace building, the Thich Nhat Hanhs, the Dalai Lamas, they all understand that it's much, much more than just getting everybody to be quiet.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, I struggle with this Abarbanel piece just because I wonder if it's actually saying that any kind of conflict, any kind of stirring things up is not good, and maybe it is an aspiration for something that's kind of quiet. But the way I want to read it of what he's saying, this more holistic shalom, this more holistic peace, is, yeah, there can be this kind of fight for social justice elements, but doing it in a way that's looking for shalom, that's looking for kind of finding balance in a respectful way. I'm worried, as you were kind of saying, about a shalom that's very harmonious and very quiet, and just because that can create sort of structural hierarchies and violence and I think that I think it's kind of mixing things up there,
and it gets into things that I don't know if there'll be other sections, but struggling for justice.
Yes.
There's a way to struggle for justice that's together with peacefulness, and there's a way that is very destructive and that actually makes things much worse. And so peace comes in there, or conflict resolution comes in there as a kind of always an ingredient of how's your social justice work going?
Right.
You know, is it making things worse or better? How's your human rights struggle going? Are you finding that you're bringing people in, you're including people, or are you just actually making matters worse? And what at every moment, with every word that you use, with every gesture, how could you sort of combine that process of redifa shalom, of pursuit of peace, together with? And I think we'll get into it.
Well, I mean, as you're saying, it's like, hopefully we'll touch upon it when we talk about how do you transform destructive conflict to constructive conflict, and we're going to talk about how you turn enemies into friends through social justice. But
in this section, the key that we're saying, I think we're both saying, is that discipleship and internalization is one of the best ways to do that. Because a good disciple of Aaron doesn't just, leave a household having the husband and wife, stop fighting so the neighbors don't hear them anymore, right? It was a heck of a lot more than that.
We'll talk about it, because I have to. Well, we'll talk about it in the next unit. Is that I'm not sure that all rabbinic models were like that. I think sometimes they were conflict containment, just keep it down. Yeah. But I think that's actually where the kind of the merger of some of the great models that have been kind of really cultivated in the conflict resolution world, together with these Jewish models, I think that can do that. But we're going to get to that. The last one of the last questions we want to really engage in is who is Aaron pursuing peace between? And and the mission, again, it's cryptic. It doesn't say. It just says pursue peace, but between who? Yeah. And here we have this source, Mishnat Rebbe Eliezer from the 8th century, where he makes Aaron into a very busy man. I mean, he is going out pursuing peace, it says here, between individuals, husband and wife, between families, family groups, and even between tribes. I mean, that's huge, because he's not just dealing with the tribal issues on that kind of intergroup conflict, but he's also dealing with the interpersonal kind of, and I find this already like a huge challenge, because I've found that a lot of conflict resolution kind of schools, if you look at different departments, I don't know enough about George Mason's, but a lot of there's like a split between the ADR, alternative dispute resolution and mediation kind of world, which is more focused on interpersonal often, and let's say peace and conflict studies that could be sometimes only focusing on deep, intractable, ethnic, religious kind of international conflicts, and not focusing as much on, okay, how do you mediate between the landlord and the it's like a different world. And I find this is like, wait a minute, to be a Rodef Shalom, you can't only be interpersonal, and you can't only be intergroup. You have to be able to do it on different levels. Obviously, you might have to prioritize, but that's a huge challenge. People ask, okay, when you're talking about Judaism and peace building, who are you talking about? International? Are you talking about? And I just like to say, yeah, we're talking about that. We're talking about interpersonal. We're talking about family. We're talking about groups. But I think it's also important to note when we talk about this as well, is like, who's not here? It's still within the Jewish people, Aaron. It's still not also with the Midianites or the Amalekites.
Well, no, Ohev es Abrios, loving at the beginning, is everyone.
Yes.
There are no limits. And
but in this particular source,
it
still is limiting. In the next source, we're going to see it expanded.
But if we, the original Hillelite model is very clearly beyond borders. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai.
Right. So
and
that's
the implications are also because there's, I think it's profoundly part of the spiritual, almost mystical notions at work here, that you cannot be committed to shalom as a name of God, or a notion of the whole, or there are Jewish mystical and Hasidic notions of les asar pnei minei. There is no place where God is not. that this is a reunification of people who are distant. This cannot know the boundaries of so-called race, which is a myth, and so-called genetic differences and nationalities. All of these are artificial constructs in a world that is supposed to be infused, or that if you have faith that there is a God, if you have faith that there is a divinity to the world, then it's all one, and the pursuit of peace can have no limits. Einstein, a wonderful quote from Einstein that says, there are only two options. I love him, we say, there are only two options. You live in a world where there are no miracles, or you will live in a world where everything is a miracle. And that notion of the miraculous, of discovering the divine in everyone, I believe is the essence of the Hillelite and Aaron model. Now, it may be that many times in Jewish history that gets narrowed because of devastating circumstances,
right.
Because it's impossible to trust anybody else in an immediate circle of enormous disempowerment. But frankly, it's far more rare than people think about in Jewish history. There's far more times where people were far more integrated, and they did have a chance. So we really have to study these texts carefully for the human element, the fallibility of context, and realize that the demands, going back to the earliest sources
yes.
of what divinity is in the world, are quite expansive. Even though in Shmuel David Luzzatto, I did my dissertation on him, he understood that you have family that you care about a little bit more, that you take care of a little bit more.
Right.
You have special obligations to your own children. But if you're the kind of person that loves your own children and hates everyone else, you don't understand peace. Right. You don't understand the concept spiritually of shalom. It has not been internalized.
Right.
And that's what I would argue
Absolutely.
And that's why there can't be limits, even though we might specialize. Some people will specialize in this or that. But
it can't be to the detriment of somebody else on that list. I want to skip and then come back to this Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, because this last source of Rabbi Eliezer Askari, I remember just when I found this a few weeks ago, and I think I sent it to you right away, I was just so excited, because here he's actually sharing his personal Rodef Shalom,
right?
Where he says, and so it was here in Tzvat that Rabbi Yosef Saramsi, who I have to be honest, you won't know anything more about this individual, other than the fact that he had a student who became very famous, the Ridbaz, that he would always place peace between fellow people, between husband and wife, and even between the idol worshippers.
Yeah.
And when I found that, I said, because I intentionally didn't want to translate it as non-Jew, because for him, idol worship was like the absolute other. There can't be any more other than calling someone an idol worshiper. But even still, he as a role model was pursuing these peace between these individuals. And this source was quoted in a wonderful Musar book called Sefer HaBrit, that I didn't bring here, I should, by Rabbi Eliezer of Vilna, 18th century. And he has 90 pages called Ahavat Re'im, loving all people. And he brings source after source after source. This is one of them, talking about you can't make that distinction between Jew, non-Jew.
This is further than non-Jew.
Yes, of course.
So many
even the person who's
idol worshiper means they have no ethical system.
Right.
They're completely barbaric.
And even still, we're going to humanize
even
that.
Still, because there's other categories of Ger Toshav and others and believers, monotheists, people who have an ethical system. Rabbi Soloveitchik always said to me, anyone who has an ethical system is not in the category of idolater already. So it doesn't mean what we should, it doesn't mean we can go ahead and observe, Christian holidays, but the idea being that idol worshiper is a very radical statement.
Right.
It's getting involved with really people who are a complete mess in terms of their ethical situation and the danger they present to you and everyone else. But you still, he says, the mitzvah extends.
And it's also, it's not between Jew and non-Jew, but the conflict. It's actually getting into their thing.
Exactly.
It reminds me of, I found once a Moroccan manuscript that from, I think, the 18th, 17th century, where you actually found the Arab Rodfei Shalom, the Muslim Rodfei Shalom, the Jaha, that they actually would
The
go in
Muslim-
sometimes,
it
their
was broken-
delegation.
The Muslim pursuers of
A
peace.
peace
And, yeah.
that actually sometimes I found one where they actually got involved in helping a Jewish conflict.
Yeah.
So here's the other way.
Yeah.
But this source was used along with, and we should talk about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, as one of these sources that it's not only an in-group thing, and how Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai would go on and pursue peace with everyone. So let's talk about that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai story.
But one thing is that he merited to see Elijah the prophet.
Yeah.
And I just want to say that a lot of people see that in magical terms, but for me, as a philosopher, a student of philosophy, as soon as I see Elijah, I see somebody making a statement about redemption, about what transforms the world in a deeper way. And so what he's saying is there that the secrets of this system of going to everyone
Right.
is when you'll start to see Elijah, when you start to see the possibilities of global transformation.
Right.
That's what Elijah says to me when I deconstruct these texts.
So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai,
Yeah.
they have this source, and this is in the Mechilta to Rabbi Yishmael, 3rd century ancient text. And here he says something amazing. He says, just like the altar, which was positioned to create peace between man and God, the stones of the altar could not have been chiseled by a tool that also could be used as a weapon. They can't be harmed. They were supposed to be shalem, whole, complete. It says, if they were not to be harmed, the stones, because they make peace between man and God, all the more so, says Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, somebody who is engaged in making peace between people should never be harmed. And his list of who these people are is the most extensive I've ever found. I mean, it's between, again, individuals, fellow people, husband and wife, family and family, but then he keeps on going. Then he says even between city and city, government and government, and then nation, ummah ummah. That's it. There is nobody else, I mean, on the planet that he could be pursuing peace. And hearing Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai say this, it's amazing because he himself seemed to have been a Kohen. He was a priest, living at this destruction of the temple for year 70, seeing this altar that it used to be a symbol, that was supposed to be a symbol of peace between man and God, being destroyed. And he, in a certain way, I see as like, he's becoming that altar.
And it was
the
destroyed
peacemaker.
by internal conflict,
Yes.
as well as with
Right, absolutely. That destruction was a symbol of hatred. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who's kind of recreating Judaism, rabbinic Judaism, is basically saying the matil shalom, here it's a different word, instead of rodeh shalom, the person who places peace between all these groups, in a way is not only replacing the altar, but he's actually even more sacred than the altar. And so 2 things really come out of this for me. One, what you're talking about beforehand, that a peacemaker should never get hurt. First of all, sometimes peacemakers get hurt. Beware. I like to say if you're doing your job not perfect but okay, then at the very least both sides will be angry with you. And it can get scary. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai almost got himself killed. I mean, he had to pretend that he was dead in order to get out of Jerusalem under siege, to not be killed by the by the extremists, to make peace with the Romans. And the other thing that comes out is this list that's so expansive. Yeah. And just to quickly bring it into Reb Chaim Hirschenson, this story about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was never, to the best of my knowledge, was never known. It was written in the 3rd century, never quoted. I've never seen anyone cite this. And Rashi, the great commentary of 11th century France, who everyone knows, going back to that 3rd grade, that common cultural language, he quotes it, but not in its complete form. And he says the pursuer of peace is going out between individuals, between husband and wife. Maybe he says in between families, but this idea of between governments and nation is forgotten, and it was out of our consciousness. And then comes along this Reb Chaim Hirschenson, 19th century, spent some time in
early 20th almost.
Early 20th, spent some time in Eretz Yisrael, some time in America. Sees
a great writer on democracy, on Jewish foundations of democracy, that Malchus work.
Okay,
Anyways,
so I'll let you fill that in.
Yeah.
You probably know more than I do about that.
He was a great philosopher and thinker.
So he notices just in a small nuance, he says, look at the difference between what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, in between Rashi was retelling.
Yeah.
And he says, well, because Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was really involved on all those levels, the interpersonal, the inter and intra-group. Even between nations he was involved.
Yeah.
But Rashi, from Reb Chaim Hirschen's perspective, that wasn't on Rashi's radar at that time. He was talking about the ethical, pushing his people ethically and saying pursue peace between individuals, families, husband and wife, but not pushing them into between nations. And I think that specifically having Reb Chaim Hirschenson say, okay, it's like inviting a question right now. And say, okay, the Jew living in the 21st century, who are we pursuing peace between? It's definitely between individuals, definitely between husband and wife, definitely between family, but how far do we go? Are we going to expand it beyond Rashi and go back to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai or not? And I think that's part of what we're doing here. We're going to be constantly testing the models that we're going to be studying together. Okay, can it be implemented here? Can we push it all the way between groups, between nations? Did you want to say something more about Chaim Hirschenson?
I'll save that
I know you
for
have a
the
thing
time.
for him. Okay.
I think we should wrap up with who our favorite
okay.
folks are.
I'll say very, 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 very quickly about the historical model.
Yeah.
Because I think it's important to know, if you look that, I brought these kind of pictures of people that were there.
Right.
3 things about them. Number 1, I've never found a Rodef Shalom. They were always Rodfei Shalom. Never in the singular. It was never an individual, except for Aaron. It was never a single person doing it by themselves.
Right.
It was always a delegation. It was always in the plural. We don't know how many.
Right.
Number 2, they weren't the rabbi. They weren't the spiritual leader. It wasn't the high priest who was going out doing it. It was lay leaders. It was business people. It was people that had a basic element of respect, who just cared. And I think that ties into the other thing, that they're almost always described as nichnasu rodfei shalom. And then the pursuers of peace entered into the conflict. They didn't wait for someone to knock on their door and say, can I pay you $300 an hour and you can solve my problem? They just went in there at any given moment. And that's part of, I think, this collectivism, this idea of taking responsibility for what's going on around us in all different areas and getting involved. And I think that's something that we should have in the back of our mind. Did you want to say anything about these?
No, I'm good with that. Oh, you mean the
other
texts?
I mean, I put it in there because I felt it was important. There are a few sources from Christianity and Islam.
There are some very good sources.
We should have it on our radar.
There's some very good texts on Judaism, on Islam and Christianity, that I think are important to frame as possible linkages between Jewish spiritual explorations of the foundations of conflict resolution and the many, many wonderful, amazing Christians and Muslims that are doing similar work.
Right.
And the kind of texts and traditions that we just have a few here, but really there's so many models going on in the Catholic world, in the Muslim world, and Shiite and Sunni, and there's many, many exciting things happening on the planet that are way beyond us. But we thought it would be fun and interesting for people studying Judaism and conflict resolution to see a couple of representative texts, although each group does things very, very differently and has their own way, even though in the end we share a higher commitment to nonviolence or to harmony or to compassion and social justice and equality. But each group sort of enters into that from their different kind of theological frameworks, ethical practices, unique cultural practices, and we thought it would be fun for people to
just
see
to have that on our radar.
Exactly.
So do you want to share, we asked everyone as part of their homework assignment of this is to start thinking about who your personal Rodef Shalom is.
Right.
And I think that's, again, about this aspiring towards role models.
Yeah.
So who is your Rodef Shalom?
It's the kind of thing I would go on and on about, but I think the two people that I think about a great deal in my life are well, it's Hillel and it's a toss-up between Gandhi and Dalai Lama.
Okay.
In the sense that for Hillel, I think Hillel's great contribution was not only the text we just studied, but another aspect of Hillel that is other texts, and that is the fact that he was famous for not being able to get for people not being able to get him angry, no matter how outrageous their behavior was, no matter how aggressive they were with him. So I think that's interesting, because in my experience, the getting into other people's conflicts or facing the worst problems in the world that everyone else is avoiding is probably the most angering and aggravating thing that I've ever done in my, in all my 30 years of working in this. And so that the spiritual discipline of both being an advocate of pursuit of peace that Hillel was, and at the same time obviously working on himself on a regular basis, on patience, on anger, was something that was really, really exciting. And yeah, because the people aggravating him were being very arrogant.
Right.
Teach me the whole Torah on one foot, and how to rebuke, and at the same time do it non-violently, do it in an embracing way. All of that was very interesting to me. And Dalai Lama and Gandhi, I think, both have had a remarkable impact, because they're way beyond nonviolence. They're in a kind of nonviolent resistance to oppression that goes to an aggressive effort to embrace as friends their enemies. Mm-hmm. And the strategic, and we'll get into this in the other sections, mm-hmm. but the strategic power of that, in the impact you have on enemies, on enemy systems, mm-hmm. is something we'll talk about, of why that's so effective. And the rabbis understood that 2,000 years ago. The Mishlei, mm-hmm. Proverbs understood that 3,000 years ago. But these are role models of men who every day worked on, and you see it in many of writings of the Dalai Lama, on working on his feelings about the Chinese. Mm-hmm. And for Gandhi, insisting that this was a loving relationship with the British, no matter how bad the oppression was, calling off any kind of protest if it was going to lead to violence against the British, removing hatred, insisting that if they leave, they're going to leave as friends. Mm-hmm. It's very rare. And to this day, nonviolent resistance globally, many, many practitioners who've fallen into this don't get that. Many, many people who are in social justice do not understand that anger and hatred completely undo your nonviolence. Mm-hmm. But Gandhi and Dalai Lama understand that, and I try to live by that every day and fail, because the anger is a part of what it is to be human, and it's very much a part of what it is to be involved in outrageous conflicts, outrageous behavior, sitting with people who are criminals, sitting with people who've abused other people, and still saying, I understand, I'm learning from this situation. This person also is a creature of God, Tselem Elokim, created in the image of God. Always remembering that is this spiritual exercise for me, and I think of these three men as people who, I try to remind myself all the time of how to keep that, be mindful
inspired towards that.
Yeah,
it's an inspiration.
Yeah. Okay. So what about for you?
Okay, so I'm, these are great models, but for me, I'd like to personalize it very much, and we've had a chance to talk about this, that if you look, it's probably still going to be there, but in the, for me, this all comes back to my relationship with my father, where I am right now in my year of mourning, and my father got involved with Judaism because he felt it was an ethical system. And I remember having discussions with him saying, well, it can be an ethical system. It can also not be an ethical system. It's up to us to make it an ethical system. But for him, it was this charge of, Judaism, with all this great text and all these great laws and things, basically comes down to being a mensch and humanizing other people. And my father was great at that. I on the dedication page, I actually found I brought an email, a line from the last line of an email that he wrote to two parties that he were connected to in an organization that he was involved with that were in deep conflict. Right. Deep conflict, personal. And he said, I want to be a Rodef Shalom using good common sense if you agree. He actually used that. He said, I want to be a Rodef Shalom. And for him it was common sense. So it wasn't just pursuing it, though. I think what actually made my father Rodef Shalom for me was that he was like Aaron, that Aaron in another rabbinic source goes around and would just say shalom to people. He would run after them to say shalom. Rodef Shalom. To the criminals, it says. To the wicked people. To the traitors. of Israel, Bogdei Yisrael, he would go and be Rodef Shalom. And just that word of saying shalom to someone is humanizing them, and it brings them closer. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was famous for that. He would go into the marketplace and say, say shalom to the Gentile, non-Jewish, other, whoever they are in that Talmudic story, and he would bring them in. And my father was famous for that. And he would say shalom. He would always be first to say shalom to whether it be the janitor, the waiter, or the business person. He just always would want to say hello first. And I think it's coming, for me, this all comes back to that basic human interaction, that first ben adam l'chavaro, that basic kind of being a mensch with the people that's sitting next to us. And then keep on going and just expanding who this in-group is of that inner circle. So I think we're going to pause here.
Good.
Thank you all very much for listening, and we're going to continue on. Great. All right, we went over.
Hour?
Yep.